It's my pleasure to chat with Dr. Martin Kulldorff, PhD, professor, Harvard Medicine. Professor, thank you for doing this. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
My listeners wanted me to tell you, and I wanted to tell you, thank you for the great Barrington Declaration. This is so important in our society. And I wonder if you would share with us how this came together, that such robust, well-respected scientists got together to say, we need to stop the lockdowns.
Well, there are many of us who work with the infectious disease immunology that has been trying to get this message out for a long time, since the spring. We thought that maybe it would be more effective if the three of us came together and did it together, because it's easier to dismiss a single person than to dismiss three people.
Yeah. I've studied COVID-19, the coronavirus now for 32 hours a week for 7 months, and I can never get to your academic level, obviously. But one thing I know is media. And I was so upset today to see CNN, and I do the radio show for Seattle, calling you guys maverick scientists. And it's my understanding that the lockdown itself is a departure from science, or the best practices in science. Is that correct?
Yeah, so lockdown is it's a terrible experiment, I think. If we go back before the pandemic, what we are proposing is what was in all the pandemic preparedness plans that different countries had prepared. And I haven't done a formal survey, but among my colleagues that I talk to that are infectious disease epidemiologists, the majority, not 100%, but the majority are in favor of this focused protection that we are proposing. So I don't see it as something maverick at all. More like stating what's established public health practice.
Yeah. I am equally disturbed, Dr. Kulldorff. Do you like to be professor or doctor when you're interviewed? You have so many titles, I'll have to choose one, I guess, but which do you prefer?
I like when people call me by my first name, Martin.
All right, I'll do that. Thank you, Martin. That's very gracious of you. That I have seen the media, members of the media, news programmers, and in fact, President Obama's former Surgeon General, rebranding herd immunity as he called it herd mentality. I listened this morning to the gentleman who runs the World Health Organization saying that herd immunity can only be achieved, Martin, by keeping people away from the virus. And this runs counter to my understanding. And I think herd immunity is important to what you're doing in this focused care of caring for the most vulnerable. So let's talk about those range of issues. Is herd immunity some weird theory?
No, it's sort of stunning as a scientist to see people talk about herd immunity in this way, because herd immunity is a well-established scientific fact, a phenomena that we know exists for infectious diseases, and every epidemiologist will acknowledge that it does exist. So it's like gravity. It's a fact in physics.
Yeah.
And to talk about herd immunity strategy doesn't make sense, because whatever strategy we use for COVID-19, we will eventually end up with herd immunity sooner or later. So it's like two airplane pilots sitting up in the airplane up in the air discussing, well, should we use the gravity strategy to land the plane or not? It doesn't make any sense. The purpose, the plane is going to get down to the ground sooner or later, no matter what they do. But the purpose is to land the plane with as few casualties as possible. And with COVID-19, the purpose is that we need to get through this pandemic with as few deaths as possible. That's the purpose.
Yeah.
We minimize the death, and that's why we propose this focused protection, because that's what will minimize the mortality.
And the focus protection, let's talk about that. That is focusing on people who are truly at risk. And my understanding, Martin, is that these are people at least above the age of 70 it's my understanding that people who pass away with or from this virus have 3 comorbid factors very commonly. Are these the people that you focus on and that the Barrington Declaration calls on to provide the most focused care and protection to?
They are included, but it's broader than that. We all know that COVID-19 is riskier for the older. Now, everybody can be infected. So it's not a difference in the risk of being infected. That's fairly equal, I think, across the ages, and no big differences. So the difference in risk is in mortality or dying from it. And it's not just a twofold or a fourfold or a tenfold. It's not even 100-fold difference in risk. The difference in risk between the oldest and the youngest is more than 1,000-fold. There's an enormous difference in risk for mortality. And among older people, COVID-19 is more serious than an annual influenza. Every year, a lot of old people die from the influenza, but COVID-19 is worse than that, much more worse. On the other hand, for children, every year about 200 to 1,000 children in the US die from the influenza, depending on if it's a bad influenza season or not. But that's more than for COVID-19. So for children, COVID-19 is less risky and a milder disease. So that's what we have to utilize. And of course, those in the 70s and 80s are at higher risk, at the highest risk. And if you have comorbidities, if you're frail, it's even worse. But also people in the 60s are fairly high risk, while people below 50 are at low risk.
I want to bridge back over to my area of expertise. One of them is media. And Martin, you and your colleagues, I want to make sure that we talk about your colleagues who helped found and create the Barrington Declaration. I've heard Professor Gupta explain that she can't get papers published that discuss T-cell immunity and crossover immunity. That's chilling to me. And I heard you say that as well-respected as you, three of you are in the world of epidemiology, that you couldn't get a witness in the media to get your word out. This is not an epidemiological question. This is a societal question. I find this chilling, Martin, and worrying. Are you guys surprised that you couldn't get witness and surprised that Professor Gupta's had problems getting papers published all of a sudden?
I think it's stunning because the three of us, we all come from reasonably respectable universities, I think.
Yes.
And back in the spring, I tried to publish these thoughts, and I had no success in the American media, whether the regular layperson media, nor in the scientific media. I am a native of Sweden, and in Sweden I had no problems publishing, so I published 3 op-eds in the major daily newspapers there. So that wasn't a problem. And but in the US, it turned out to be impossible for me. Until about a month ago, things started to change.
Yeah. And I'm very thankful. I've seen your piece in Spiked, which is a very important publication, LinkedIn piece you wrote, The Spectator, all excellent pieces. I'm of the position with my audience, Martin, that the word cases is an empty scare word. And I liken it this way. If I were to say that there have been 200,000 mechanical incidents with the 737 airplane this month, you probably wouldn't fly one. And if I said, but 90, and you'll get the number I'm using here, 99.73 or 87% of these were the toilets, the speakers in the stereos. It didn't involve anything safety oriented. You would reconsider. What does a case mean? I mean, what is a case?
That's a great analogy. It used to be that a case was somebody who was sick. And if you are sick of COVID-19 and you have to go to the hospital, then you're a case. But defining cases as somebody who is asymptomatic and has a positive PCR test doesn't make any sense for me. And I've talked to physician colleagues, and it doesn't make sense to them.
It makes sense to me from a perspective of media. It's a big number, and it's an impressive number. And I wanted to talk to you about this asymptomatic phenomenon with the PCR cycles. You had mentioned the 1,000-fold order of magnitude difference between young people and older people in relation to the fatality rate of this disease, the COVID. And the PCR cycle testing, I'm at a loss as to understand how the 40-cycle PCR test is viable. It's my understanding that you are magnifying the genetic material, Martin. Is it correct to say, someone told me 1 trillion times, so that you can find a shred of incomplete genetic material? Is that true?
Yeah, so it's interesting how the cycle times for PCR test is now common knowledge in this world, which it wasn't a year ago. But if with any test, there will be false positives and false negatives. So if you mass test college students that are asymptomatic, you're going to have some false positives for whatever reasons. And you're basically going to isolate or quarantine a lot of students who are not sick and who are not pose risk to others. So in my view, there's no public health reason at all to do testing among college students or school children, unless they are so sick that they go to the hospital. Then you have to test them because you have to know what treatment you're going to give them. Do they have COVID-19 or not? But to test just asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, there's no public health reason to do that. There is reason to test the nursing home staff, for example, because you don't want this to get into the nursing homes. So unless the nursing home staff is already immune, you want to do frequent testing of them. You also want to test visitors to nursing home because they're not only risking the life of the loved ones, but also other people in the nursing home. Yeah. So their testing is very important. And to me, there it's better to be more safe than sorry. So a false positive is not a huge issue because it means they have to visit their grandmother 3 weeks later. On the other hand, a false negative could have dire consequences. So in that setting, you have to have a threshold that makes you more safe than sorry. But then to use that same threshold for school kids is nonsensical. And I don't think you should test school children at all. If a child is sick, they have a cough or running nose, let them stay home. Doesn't matter if it's COVID-19 or not. If they're asymptomatic, they should be in school and learn what they need to learn.
Is it a correct understanding, and Martin Kulldorff is with us, PhD, professor, Harvard Medical School, as he said, a reasonably well-respected medical school, as are your colleagues, Oxford, et cetera. Professor, is it a fair thing to say that if young people get back on with their lives, we're not just helping society, because I want to talk about the lives lost, I think, due to the lockdown, but are we also not reducing the places that the virus can live? Isn't that one of the roles of herd immunity and younger people, that we take away places the virus can live, sort of as it lies in wait for an older person or a sicker person?
Yeah, so there are two problems with the lockdown. One is all the collateral damage. And there's collateral damage for public health, worse cardiovascular disease outcomes, plummeting vaccination rates. Cancers are not detected. So somebody who would have lived for maybe 15, 20 years will maybe die now in 3 to 4 years. So we won't see that in the mortality statistics this year, but this is something we're going to have to live with for a long time. A big problem is the mental health issues, both for the young and the old. So there's all that collateral damage. But even if you put that aside and we only look at COVID-19, what it does is it pushes things forward. So if you're an old person, 74 years old, say, you have to be very careful and take precautions and not mingle with people too much. But if we do the lockdown, we're pushing things in the future. So the amount of time that the older people have to do this, protect themselves, is going to be long. It's going to be over a year now, and it could be even more than that. And the longer time they have to self-isolate, the more difficult it is, both in terms of their own social life and mental health being, but also just protecting them from COVID-19, because at some point they're going to have to go to the doctor or the dentist. So the longer we drag it out, the more difficult it is to protect the elderly, high-risk people in the population.
Yeah.
So by young people protecting themselves from the disease, they're making a disservice by doing so.
Fascinating. And Doctor, I've read an analysis from you and I have a common friend, a friend in common. Dr. Martin Kulldorff with us, Harvard University, the Barrington Declaration, one of the founders there. I'm one of the three founders. We have some friends in common who are independent data analysts. Justin Hart with Rational Grounds. I had met one of your colleagues, Dr. Atlas, in March of this year. And then I work with a gentleman, he goes on Twitter by the title of Ethical Skeptic. I know who he is. He's a naval intelligence officer, independent data analyst. And it's really fun because he does this data analyst, doctor. And then Martin, he opens this up for peer review. Here's my source material. Here's my mathematical assumptions. He contends that we are going to see a 100-fold loss of life years from the lockdown. Life years, you mentioned the younger people may die sooner. He has also analyzed that he feels like right now that we may be losing more people from the lockdown than from COVID itself. Does that sound out of proportion to you, or what are your observations as where we sit today with that loss of life?
I think it's huge and terrifying with the negative consequences of the lockdown, the collateral damage. Some of it is sort of already occurring, but a lot of it is going to have long-term consequences. So we won't see it in the mortality statistics until later on.
Yeah.
So, and how to quantify it is, of course, difficult. We can quantify maybe, it's even difficult to quantify just the effect on cancer, for example, but to do it across all health aspects is very difficult. But for sure, it's tragic and scary. And the longer the lockdown continues, the worse it's going to be. And you mentioned, for example, Scott Atlas, who have met. And what we're saying in the Great Barrington Declaration is nothing novel or new. These are things that many of us have said for a long time, including Dr. Atlas since the spring. So he is one other person who has been trying to get this message out. And I was very excited when he was hired to join the White House to sort of help there from the inside. So that was a very positive development in my view.
I have this observation as we close out. You've been so kind with your time. This is where I find myself deeply concerned as someone who has taken a deep dive in learning this tiny little bit of what you know in your profession. And man, I wish I knew I could have studied epidemiology. It is absolutely fascinating.
It is.
B, I'm glad that people are studying it. I'm so thankful for the Barrington Declaration. I do a bit of pattern recognition. I'm very concerned because I really observed that there was sort of pre-COVID-19 science, which was evidentiary based and based on observable, testable, measurable, falsifiable. And then I feel like post-COVID-19, there's been a departure from this, that I'd seen the World Health Organization caution against lockdowns in the case of a SARS-type respiratory viruses. Dr. Fauci had cautioned against, or members of his team had. I feel like all of a sudden there was this departure from scientific rigor. Is that a layman's misunderstanding, or do you think that happened?
No.
Okay.
It's not a misunderstanding. Right now, the priority is to deal with this pandemic. That's what we have to do now. But once we have, we're going to have to deal with reduced public trust in the scientific community. And I think it's stunning how it has played out, that the scientific discourse has been sort of silenced. And it's something that the scientific community is going to have to deal with once this is over. And it will be interesting to see how it's dealt with. But certainly it's an issue going forward. I still believe fully in science. I think that's the foundation of our civilization since hundreds of years. But my trust in the scientific community has taken a hit for sure.
Okay, I did think of one more question because of what you said, because this just, it hit me very hard emotionally to sense in you also that you've observed the same thing, and that you have been silenced, and that your colleagues have been silenced. That shouldn't happen. And I pictured Bill Gates. I used to work for Bill. I mean, several steps removed, but I used to work at Microsoft, and I've met him. He gets on any TV he wants. Columbia Journalism Review wrote about him purchasing positive coverage. What's it like for you as a recognized expert, or your colleagues recognized experts, to not be able to get on TV? How do you feel when you watch Bill Gates saying the world can't go back to normal until the second round of vaccines?
It was stunning to observe media saying that there is scientific consensus for something that I did not agree with, and me feeling that I knew a lot, having worked with infectious disease outbreaks for a couple of decades, and it didn't make sense to me. I didn't agree with it, so that was sort of a stunning experience. And then when I tried to humbly say that what I thought, it wasn't interesting to hear what I had to say. But that has changed now, so I'm very very appreciative of that. And there has, from the beginning, been certain media outlets that have been more open-minded, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. I am so thankful for the Barrington Declaration. We're going to link to it. We'll make sure we get as many professionals and lay people signing it as possible. Professor, I thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for speaking out, and thank you for restoring my trust in scientists. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been delightful to talk with you.
You too.